Okay, we're going to look into a genetics dissertation done by Johannes Krause of the Max Planck Institute of Science and Human History out of Tübingen. He's become quite famous. He's somebody that's on the cutting edge of actually genetic studies and things, and him correlating with a few others like Svante Pabo and a few others that are notables in the fields, and correlating their data together have been able to really start to reveal a whole lot more about genetic data and things. And this is part of a field that really doesn't involve archaeology in people's minds quite a bit or quite often, but it it's becoming the new form of type of archaeology. For years we've gone off of linguistics and things, and then blade technology, bifacial blade technology, early flint things, earliest pottery designs, corded ware, things like that, and have tried to use this to correlate things. And I knew once DNA got down pat that it should probably show us something that's quite revealing, and it might help to enforce certain things. I had a ideal some 35, 40 years ago now, what the way that it had gone, and it seemed odd that it all came from Eurasian steppes and into England, and then mentally you try to have this idea that they fought with a Viking type of people, but this predates this quite a bit. Anyhow, let's just get into this, and I'll try to keep my vamping down to a minimum if I can.
So thanks for the invitation. So I would like to talk today about a more recent chapter in human history. So we have heard a lot about the early chapters of human history today, about the early evolution of modern humans in Africa, and also about the interaction between archaic humans and early modern humans. But I would like to talk today and turn our focus from the Ice Age, the Pleistocene, into the Holocene, so into the last 10,000 years of human history. And I try to convince you that this is also an extremely exciting time period where we even see a lot of changes even in human evolution and in human phenotype in several parts of the world. So as I mentioned, we're actually living today in this time period, the Holocene, which is a time period of relative climate stability. Some people might even say that we have actually changed our environment so much that we're now living in a time period which we call the Anthropocene, which might have started in the last 2,000 years, but the main focus of this talk should really be the Holocene, so the last 2,000 years, last 10,000 years of human history. Most of this time.
And really, he's going to speak about from here back, from 1700 back, and the odd change that had happened here some 10,500 BC that ended the Pleistocene and started the Holocene is another event I go into quite a bit, but then that shows the retro effect of these people going. And as he's talking about now, we have historical documents that go back 3,000 BC, and they just fade, and we start to see them now, but as they fade in time, we had a fade in knowledge. As I was speaking about before, genetics is going to show us something.
Time period, actually, we do not have historical documents. So we have no information that people wrote down about human history in this last 10,000 years. So we usually have to rely on archaeological information, for example, or paleoanthropological findings, so human skeletons, for example, that might tell us something about things that changed in the past. So something, for example, like a migration, genetic admixture, or the genetic turnover of the human population. But we and others have actually started in the last few years to use genetic data to tell us something about changes that happened recently in our evolution or in history. And I would like to focus my talk today about one event that archaeologists had already identified many years ago, and that is probably the biggest change in human history that happened in the last few million years. And it's actually the change from the subsistence strategy of hunting and gathering to Neolithic farmers that relied on agriculture and started to domesticate animals. And this revolution, this big change in human history, is called the Neolithic Revolution. So this Neolithic Revolution started in Central Europe about 7,500 years ago, and in other parts of the world a few thousand years earlier and a few thousand years later. But this big change is really the cornerstone of our modern civilization, because it provided people then with resources that actually allow us to sustain millions and even billions of people today. And that basically came with this big change from this foraging lifestyle to this early farming life.
And it's the switch between the two. But what we're looking at here is going to be people that were mobile foragers, and they hunted and gathered, and they started some farming, and then they would move back and forth and back and forth, and it would be a migrational thing to a people that created a civilization and would stay there through the seasons, being able to control it and not have to migrate like a lot of birds and other animals type do, and go more of a valley back up situation. And these people in these migrations quite often took a route where they would, what's on the other side of this valley? And I do that valley to this area, to this flat plain, to these mountains, to this, and it just continues and continues in migrations and movements and stuff from these people that were extremely interested in what's over that hill. Maybe it's something great. Maybe there's a diamond the size of an elephant over there. Maybe there's, who knows what, but they were looking for it. And they turned from that, and what helped them to do so was harnessing things that they would hunter and gather, and realizing that those created their own seeds. And then if they just put those seeds here, they would make that crop grow. Of course, then you expound on that idea and you plant a tree like an apple tree, and it takes quite some time, or olive trees like what's mentioned in the Bible, and it takes quite some time, but yet in the same endeavor, we've helped to make something in this area. They plant a whole bunch of apple seeds. They leave and come back, leave and come back. These apple trees are growing. Now as they come back, there's a crap load of apples for them whenever they come back and forth, back and forth. Eventually some people might want to hang exactly where those apple trees are through the seasons if they can develop other crops, things like that. And of course, milk and its ability too, which we thought came a lot earlier, is showing to be a later thing, to where people could ingest milk at a later time. The lactose intolerant thing seems to pull a later date than we originally concepted, even though the cattle comes earlier. Let's continue.
What archaeologists have debated for more than 100 years now is whether this change of subsistence strategy from foraging to farming was actually related due to the spread of ideas and culture. So was it just culture and ideas that were passed on from village or from region to region, or was it actually people that were bringing agriculture to different parts of the world, for example, to Central Europe about 7,000 years ago?
So the question here is, in what he's just simply presenting, I'm sure you probably get the idea, is that did they just meet each other merchant-wise, perhaps, and teach somebody a new way to do pottery, and then those people started mimicking the other people's pottery? Or are these people actually ingested into that civilization and the pottery came with them? And there's a big debate on that idea, with a lot of these archaeologists record where it spreads, but the people maybe didn't, and all these other situations. And genetics kind of helps to show the truth and reality in that.
This big question was it pots or people that basically then spread agriculture into Europe and other parts of the world. And this question is very hard to address just based on archaeological artifacts, for example, or anthropological findings, because it is very difficult to really see if biological identity of people changes just based on archaeological artifacts. And this is actually a question which is much easier to address if we look at genetic data. So if we look at the DNA, if we look at the genetic makeup of the people, because it makes very clear predictions for these two different hypotheses, whether it was ideas that were spreading during that time or whether it was actually people. So if we assume that ideas and culture was, for example, spreading agriculture, we would expect that there would be direct genetic continuity between, for example, the first people that lived in Europe, foragers, then thousands of years ago, and then the first Neolithic people, and then the people that live in Europe today. So you would see genetic continuity if it was just the spread of ideas.
So what we're going to probably see here is a genetic scope that he's going to show, and it's going to show you that coming out of the last ice age, that in certain areas the genetics were slightly different, the people were slightly different, a variation on a theme but then tracking those and seeing where it all goes. It's kind of a simplistic thing, and sometimes they go a little long-winded with it, or they can't speak it just correctly. I've tried to wean myself off long-wind since being retired now.
However, if it was actually people spreading agriculture, for example, into Europe, we would expect a genetic discontinuity. Something, see, that's called the epidemic diffusion. We would actually see that people would then, for example, come to Europe and change the genetic structure, so new genes would arrive, for example.
So, in other words, do people just meet and then these people have the stuff? Or do these people meet and then all of a sudden there's a big component of these people in this stuff? It's kind of a simplistic bubble picture drawn model.
And we and many others have tried to address this question based on mitochondria, but as we have seen in some of the previous talks, mitochondrial DNA can be quite decisive. So therefore we have decided then in the last few years to actually study whole genomes of early farmers as well as late hunter-gatherers, so ancient foragers, to study this question whether there was actually a genetic change of people when agriculture was introduced to Europe, or whether there was direct genetic continuity. So we have sequenced genomes of about...
And being able to do that has changed everything, because then they're able to look down alleles and sequences and seeing at what point they interjected. And after having done this a few thousand times, they're really starting to realize how genomes and alleles fit in and how they subsist and move over time, and at what times they came in and did certain things. And I just want to point out here whenever he shows this, because he's going to walk right over it, that Ötzi, the Iceman, is found right here, right? But then just above it is Stuttgart man, and you see this type of thing, and it's flayed out wrong, but he seems to be slightly prognostic compared to the other people that are around here. It's probably just the way they flayed it out. Then there's Motala man, it's up here, that seems like a primordial man also. And these are all people that are coming out of Cro-Magnon and developing into our currents here. And then Lishabor, which is more of an earlier forager, definitely an ancient forager, and we find Labrana man here with this even thinner nasal slit that's here, showing the definite Caucasoid, but a squared off heading too that looks a little more Cro-Magnon, although it's amazing what it looks like whenever they show you the recreation of what it would have probably looked like. But just you see these skull forms that seem a lot different, but you might be amazed if you just took a group of people with oval heads and round heads, square heads and things like that, some big jawed people and so on, and looked at their skulls and what you would think in your mind that they look like versus what they actually did look like right before that. But so he's looking at this wide genome set here and going to go on with it.
12 early hunter-gatherers some years ago, and combined that with data sets that had been provided by other people, for example, like the Iceman genome, this famous Tyrolean mummy that was discovered a few years ago and was actually frozen for about 5,000 years in the Alps, as well as a genome from a hunter-gatherer that was found here in Spain some years ago. And we then compared those ancient human genomes with the genome of about 2,000 people that come from various populations, about 200 populations in the world today, with a data set that is called the Human Origins data set, and it has basically genome-wide data of now up to 5,000 people from many different populations in the world. If you then take genomic data from ancient and modern people and you want to compare that, you can imagine, you have heard, those genomes are really big, there's a lot of data, and one way to break down this data into two dimensions that you can actually look at is a so-called principal component analysis, where you basically take this genetic information from all those people and break it down into two most informative components, principal component 1 and 2, and if you do that for modern people, you get those beautiful, colorful clouds that you see here.
Now, one thing to point out whenever they do something like this is what we're really looking at is they look at this huge, long string of genetic data. And in this genetic data, you could say that due to the alleles turning on and off and the signals that are run through it, and just A's and T's and so on, that what you're having is a song, if you will. Just mentally think of it that way, where if we take a record that goes round and round and round and unravel it and made a long strand out of it here, right? Then and we also, of course, have a left side and a right side of the groove, and we take and look at that as it goes down. These people have similar songs to each other whenever they're grouped up, right? and extremely similar songs to each other, to where you're like, oh, that's just the 1950s version of the same song. They just redone it, things like that. Other things start to stretch out a little farther and so on. And you find these clouds of this constant that's running here that doesn't necessarily contain these others, but then there's bleeding, and then there's pockets where certain people are at. And he's talking about early European farmers, Western European hunter-gatherers, Scandinavian types, ancient North Eurasians, and so on. And the group here that he's figuring on and talking about here is now is Georgian type people, Osselan, and where the Utsi supposedly had come from.
Actually, if you look at the right cloud here, this cloud is actually people that live today in northern Africa, in the Near East, as well as in the Caucasus. So you actually see this line that stretches from northern Africa into the Caucasus. Those populations here are populations that live in Europe today. So people that live, for example, in Iberia, France, Central Europe, as well as Great Britain or Russia.
And I think he just verified the fact that of the diaspora of the people that I've been telling you about coming out of Egypt and North Africa, and that those people are currently Northern Europeans whenever the land had gone to crap and it all started to become a wasteland where they had ended up. Let's continue.
We actually see here almost resembles geography. If you imagine this is kind of the northern African coast, this is the Near East, here could be the Black Sea, this could be the Mediterranean. So it could be an isolation by distance. People moved into those places and then basically genetically slowly changed over time. However, if we now look at our ancient individuals, our ancient foragers, as well as the early farmers from 7,000 years ago, we first see that our ancient foragers are genetically actually quite distinct from the people that live in Europe today. There seems to have been not a strong continuity between the ancient foragers and modern Europeans. So basically, there are no modern Europeans that live today that look genetically like ancient foragers. This is actually different for the ancient farmers. So those 7,000-year-old farmers from Central Europe, they actually do cluster with populations that live in Europe today. You could see this little green cloud here. If you look at this cloud, this is actually people that live in Sardinia today. And this was already discovered when the Iceman genome was sequenced some years ago. The colleagues actually found that the Iceman looked genetically very similar to people that live in Sardinia today. And that actually made the authors to hypothesize that maybe he was some sort of tourist from Sardinia that had gotten lost in the Alps and just died there and froze to death.
This is the type of odd, stupid thing you'll get people to come up with whenever they're following pottery and corded wares and things like that, and not even think into the fact that this person might even migrate from place to place, that he could have been here and migrated place to place. We've seen this in a lot of the skeletons we found in Stonehenge area and so on, that by doing the strontium test onto them, find that they didn't even come from here. They come from hundreds of miles away, and so on. And so, well, the Sarsen stone did also. Some of them show up to be right around the Sarsen stone area, and so they must have brought it there. Others show to be from there, and the ancient Druids and so on. And each one of these can be picked apart and shown in this genetic way, and then more newer information gleaned out of it. Let's continue.
Today we actually know that this was not quite the case, because we now have genomic data from many early farmers from Scandinavia, from Iberia, from Central Europe, from Southern Europe, and they all cluster together with Sardinians. So it is not that they all come from Sardinia, it is rather that modern Sardinians look genetically like early farmers.
That's an important statement there. You see how that's not reversed, that's compiled. Okay.
But what you then also see is that people that live in Europe today are not just a simple mixture between those ancient populations, so the foragers and the farmers. We actually stretch all the way up here, and if you can actually see those little diamonds up there, there's some more ancient genomes which are on this plot. That are actually populations which we call ancient North Eurasians, which are best represented by people that lived about 10 to 20,000 years ago in Siberia. For example, one child that was sequenced by the group in Copenhagen from Lake Baikal, which is called the Malta child. So you see that modern Europeans seem to be a mixture between those three ancient genetic populations.
And he's saying that the northern Scandinavian people that were originally there in the last ice age, not coming out of it, were slightly different from that. And perhaps more of an Inuit type of people But no, they were definitely a pale Caucasian Scandinavian type. And one wonders why over here they are like that, and over in Russia they were more of an Inuit Asiatic type that looks much more like the Amerindians were. Let's continue.
What is also very clear is that if you look at that, neither the ancient farmer nor the ancient forager seem to have this North Eurasian component. So this North Eurasian component is actually quite distinct, and we wanted to find out when did this ancient North Eurasian component arrive in Europe. To do that, we teamed up with David Rice's team as well as Svante Pääbo, and collected also data from the team in Copenhagen, and now put together a data set of about 230 ancient human genomes that span 8,000 years of European history.
And the reddish rings are the origins, then it goes orange yellow, and we go through the spectrum into modern blues. And it's strange that it shows reds to here turn into blues from here and here, here, and so on, and even a group out in here. But let's continue. Just noting that.
To see when the kind of different genetic components over the last 8,000 years form. So now we actually go forward in time, starting about 8,000 years ago, and look at the genetic structure of Europe. What you see here in the background, those gray dots are the modern populations, and those are the ancient individuals. So
that's just another representation of the color dots that they showed, and instead of breaking it into all individual areas and where they are now and so on, they're just comparing it to the hunter-gatherers and seeing how far they were off and then correlating data from there.
The first thing you observe if you look at the ancient foragers, so the indigenous Europeans or Western Eurasians, you see that they form this little cloud here, and that there's a gradient from the west to the east. So this was the genetic structure of the hunter-gatherers that lived in Europe about 8,000 years ago. If you look at the same time into the region here, which is Turkey today, Anatolia, you can see that the Anatolians at that time, they already practiced agriculture, so they're Neolithic, so they're early farmers, and they're genetically actually quite distinct from those Europeans that lived at the same time in Europe. If you then move ahead in the next 1,000 years, agriculture comes to Europe, and suddenly, when you look at the people that lived in Europe at the time, they look exactly like those Anatolian Neolithic farmers. So it seems very clear now that this Neolithic package actually spread with those people, because Europeans suddenly look like that and not look like that anymore. So that is very strong evidence now.
It's very strong evidence. If you'll look, I don't know, you'd have to really look in here. This is small pictures, and I'm sorry for its size here, but he shows you the Hungary, Iberia places, but he also shows you the Andronova cultures and so on, and how they fit into this idea here. And then, so you have Andronovos, and then these, and the close related, and Iberia, and so on, and what they end up being later. And you can see this grouping here is not far off, but it's more like this is like that, this is like that, this is like that, and they attach into them, but they show you their locuses of being far off and how far off center base for each one they are. Takes computer programs and stuff and people knowing how to do their logarithms to be able to pull these type of things off.
That there was this discontinuity of the people, that genetically there was this large change of people, and at that time period, about 7,500 years ago in Central Europe. If we now move in the next 2,000 years of human history in Europe, we can actually see that the population structure doesn't really change so much. Genetically, people look, again, quite similar to those early farmers from Anatolia, but you can actually see a little bit of this movement in this direction, and this is indeed something that we observe, that there seems to be a bit of genetic admixture with hunter-gatherers that lived in Europe at the time, probably still in mountain ranges and in regions where agriculture was unfavorable.
And this is kind of like the scattering or the afar, or the mountain people, and Lothar of the hill people meeting these early Neolithic farmers, right?
There was a bit of genetic admixture between those early farmers and the hunter-gatherers that were living in Europe. However, again, this is modern Europeans. We're not really somewhere down here, so what's happening? We should kind of look a bit more to the east. And this is the same time period that we just looked at in Central Europe, now looking at Eastern Europe, so looking at the populations which are found here. So this is north of the Black Sea, of the Caspian Sea. You can actually see that this population, which is Neolithic or Bronze Age steppe population, so those are also agriculturalists, they're not sedentary but pastoralists, so they're herding, for example, cows. And
this is your Proto Indo Europeans that we keep talking about.
This population is very homogeneous, stretching all kind of this region here. And again, they're kind of falling up here, quite distinct from the early farmers of Europe, also quite distinct from the hunter-gatherers. And you can actually see they're also pretty close to this Neolithic individuals here, which are actually late hunter-gatherers from this region, but they're a bit more stretched in this direction, in fact. And there seems to be something hiding here, and something I don't really have time to talk today about, but that would be a different chapter in human history.
And I'll go into that in another video. It's a variation or a pull off of this that shows you something quite different. But then again, he shows you here the Eurasian steppes and where these people were, these people that end up being your Europeans that we know today, and where that comes. And you can see it's not far off. And also that Samara culture, it's right there attached to it. In fact, definitely attached to it. You can see it is attached to it. Let's continue.
But what's now going on with the modern Europeans that live today in Central Europe? When does their genetic makeup actually form?
They're surrounded.
This has actually been happening about 4,800 years ago. 4,800 years ago, you suddenly have a major shift in the genetic structure of Europe. So if we move now to this time period, 4,800 years ago to about 3,000 years ago, suddenly you have people in Central Europe that look like people that live in Central Europe today. So they are a genetic mixture of this steppe component that we have in the Bronze Age here in the steppe.
And you can see in his depiction here, he's showing you they go farther east, they come into here, it's these people, and it comes from those original people around Anatolia and so on, right? Let's continue.
Well as this early and middle Neolithic people that you had in Central Europe at the time. So there seems to be a massive event of migration. Suddenly you see this massive shift, and you don't only observe that in Central Europe and in Southern Europe, but you even observe that in Central Asia as well as in the Altai. There seems to be very strong evidence now for a large migration. We can then also...
That's all he's going to say about what we've been referring to, is there seems to be some large migration. But let's go back. And so he's going into this right here, but it shows you too, and if you look at the Anatolia area, that's where the Tigris and Euphrates come up to the top of. That's where the area was talked about in the Bible. The land that was fertile down below that, it was called Eden by the Sumerians, very much predating this. And this is after Catalhoyuk and so on in timelines, right? This is definitely not 6500 BC. We're half that distance almost, and starting to come into recorded history.
So quantify those genetic components in the different populations that live in Europe today. So those three ancestral components, early foragers, the early farmers, as well as this steppe pastoralists. You can actually see there is a decline. So populations that live in Northern Europe today or Northeastern Europe, they have quite a high amount of steppe ancestry and quite a low amount of early farmer ancestry.
You can see here where you talked about the original Sardinians, now how they hadn't changed much, and that they had the ancient farmer and a little bit of your steppe pastoralis come in, right? And in the middle of that you have foragers, and what genetics hold up all of that. Whenever at one time there were all foragers here, right? But some of these people turned into each of these other varieties. But as we go into Spanish, Greek, Basque, Tuscan, and so on, we can see definitely a major ancient farmer culture that's come in all the way through Croatia, South France, Orcadian, the Orcs, English, Ukrainian, and we start to get in here where you can see the steppe pastoralis and the areas we're talking about now, where even in English it seems to be almost a 50-50 thing. We get here in Ukraine, Hungarian, Belisar, Czech, Scottish, Icelandic, Estonian, Lithuanian, and Norwegian. We show more of the steppe ancestry, and so more of the origin of there and less secondary mix. Let's continue.
Whereas the people that live in Sardinia today have almost exclusively early farmer ancestry, as I've shown you before, and very, very little ancestry here from the steppe. And if you look at the ancient populations you can actually see that if you move from back in time towards today, you can see that early on we have this really strong component of early farmer ancestry from Anatolia. Over time you have a little bit of this forager indigenous European admixture that seems to happen over the next few thousand years. But then 4,800 years ago, you suddenly have this green component coming in, the steppe.
Suddenly, you have it come in and everything twists off to the other way.
Component. In Central Europe, we actually see about a 70% replacement of the local agriculturalists happening 4,800 years ago, an event that actually no archaeologist or paleoanthropologist had predicted so far. So there seems to have been really a mass migration at the end of the Neolithic. So in summary, what we can say is that agriculture likely spread from the Near East through Anatolia into Central Europe, starting about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So it was actually people coming to Europe introducing agriculture. What we also have then, when the agriculturalists are spreading in different parts of Europe, going to Scandinavia in the next 2,000 years, to Great Britain as well as to Iberia, we seem to have a bit of genetic admixture with the local hunter-gatherers that are still present in Europe at the time. And then in the late Neolithic, about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, you have this, it seems to be massive migration coming from this region here, from a culture which is called the Yamnaya, which is genetically extremely close with people that have a culture which is called the corded ware, that stretches all the way up to the Baltics, as well into Switzerland here and into Western Europe. So there was this massive migration which expanded into the west here, into Central Europe, as well as into the other direction, into.
And it also went east, and this spreads out, and this culture are extremely close related to each other. Well, you would call them cousins, and in fact previous cousins, a few generations down, more like 1,400 years, but let's go.
The Altai Mountains. And one of the big questions we currently have is, how was that possible? We can easily explain why there was this first migration of agriculture to Europe, because you could imagine that agriculture can sustain a much bigger population. So the first people that brought agriculture to Europe probably had a much bigger population size. But then how was it possible that 5,000 years ago, those early farmers were replaced by other farmers? So what did those farmers have when they came here that kind of made them able to replace the people that lived in Central Europe? And we don't really have a.
Was it superior grains? Was it that they came in with carts and wheels and horses and things like that? Or was there a dispersal of a disease that wasn't relevant to the people that had previously not had exposure because of not being hooked up to cattle farming? Let's look what he says about that concept, perhaps.
Good explanation currently, but our colleagues from Copenhagen recently published a study where they could actually find that in those people that came to Europe, they actually found Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of plague, which is actually quite incredible. But it seems that during this time, about 4,500 years ago, plague was for the first time introduced to Europe, potentially causing a pandemic. And you could imagine if we have a pandemic, like for example during the Black Death, where 50% of the people in Europe died, if something like that happened 5,500 years ago, it could open an ecological niche, so people could actually move in and then replace the local farmers.
Much like what happened in the Americas or something along that line, where the smallpox and things actually outraced the humans' contact with them, and before we had a chance to run into them, quite a bit of them were gone somehow. But and how smallpox was introduced into the United States was due to people that had been brought into the United States that had never been exposed to it before, like the Aryans, and their breakout was like a catalyst for it. This is a strange diagram here. We're going to find a few things here too.
Just briefly, what we could also do is we could actually also look at genetic and phenotypic change through time. We could actually look at different phenotypes, how they change over the last 8,000 years, to look at evolution basically in situ. What we saw was actually quite surprising, that the first Europeans, or the Europeans that lived about 8,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherers, they actually had a very distinct phenotype from people that live in Europe today. They actually had dark skin and blue eyes. All of them, you can actually see that 100% frequency of those foragers had blue eyes and dark skin.
Now, the show a picture here, which is somewhat misleading, but it's hard for him to grab somebody necessarily always with darker skin and blue eyes. But this is a Negroid with a genetic mutation to their eyes that they have found that that's how it keeps showing up in black people. In fact, it's more often a golden type of eye that looks even more beautiful, I think, than blue eyes because it's so odd. It doesn't look real. But it's a genetic mutation where there's a fat layer that's created in between your eyes and it creates a prismatic effect. So it's kind of neat. You zoom in on something like that and you're like, wow, that's just, it almost looks like some type of swirl of colors. It's wicked, but it reflects out a yellow color. And then there's one that opposites it and does like a blue color. Let's look at something here real quick about Brawny Man and who that was that they were talking about there. This Brawny Man is somebody who had darker skin or an olivish type skin. It wouldn't necessarily have been as dark as the picture he shows, but he wants to show the variation. And of course, to a crowd from a distance, you go with that. But this is the guy he's talking about, Brawny Man. And so he's just a little more swarthy in things. And was he as dark as something like this, which has an Indian admix into a Caucasian? No. In fact, he looks a whole lot like this hunk man here that was part of the 300, but with a tan, with more of a tan, like you'd see more on this guy here and so on. Now, of course, there's Cheddar Man that showed out, and then somebody wanted a black shoe polish him, and that's kind of disgusting. The person there would have just had a more of olive or darker skin. There's another man in the area that has a look that looks much more like this. And so what would that tell you? That's the way he looks. This is not the way that they looked, right? And they'll take pictures a lot of times, and black people have gone crazy on this. Oh, we were the Europeans, and it's like, no. It wasn't a black kid with a genetic mutation that looks like this, which they're trying to say, look, Brawny was a black man, black people were there. And they try to show you other black people that have blue eyes or a genetic thing, or maybe people in India that have a blue-eyed form that stands out. These people had that as a genetic character. It wasn't a mutation that was popping or anything like that. The light skin gene shows up at about 600,000 BC, they found now, and becomes a blanket over this entire area at 60,000 BC. So it's actually the oddity that this man had more of a swarthy skin and was more north, probably showing you where he'd originally come from, closer to the equator and stuff. But when you look at somebody even named LeBron here, they have this type of look to them. And of course, like people, oh, LeBron James, and it's like, no. You have this light of a person, you have a person with a darker or swarthy skin, like this man here. This guy here has more of a darkened or olive skin as a constance. It's not necessarily, and he's just an Italian guy. But so that's more of an appearance of the way it would be, and it's not necessarily trying to show you something odd like that. I guess here's another good picture here that will show you somebody who has swarthy skin. And a lot of this is really just current tanning, I guess you'd say, too. And wants to hop all over the place. And so it really wasn't, well, you find sites like this, sorry to show you this in the middle of this, but how Europeans became white. And this is on a site that's showing you, oh, it's black people were original, no, and that's not what they're saying in any way, shape, or form. That the genetics of this doesn't show up in Europe at all. And his difference is, this is here where you have a man from Papua New Guinea, and he's basically giving him his shirt, and he rolled up a cigarette, gave him a cigarette. He's going to keep the machete handy over here, but it's got a little gourd penis cover going on there, and nuts. More like these people here, and again, has nothing to do with this. These aren't black people as far as Negroids either. These have a different Denisovan, an ancient thing that goes through Australoids and a lot of the Fiji Islanders, and also doesn't contain the Negroid of the West Africans who keep trying to project themselves into anything that's around like this, but more of a swarthy look. So let's go back here to presentation here and show you what he shows you about that.
So that actually goes down blue eyes frequency then with the early agriculturists and then spreads again in the last few thousand years. And
So what he shows you is the blue-eyed gene was constant in these. It was 100%. It was pegging. So these were all blue-eyed Aryan type people. Well, are they saying the Aryans were dark-skinned? No. No. This is a different variation on a theme, and it's shown up to be an oddity. It's not showing up to be the. But the blue-eyed gene falls down, and then you end up with multicolored eyes quite a bit due to interjection. And then the interjection goes a lot stronger with blue-eyed people during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age we're talking about, and then gets even higher up here, showing you that the influx from the east that came through also contained this component, and it became stronger and stronger and stronger.
Actually, light skin that we have so typically in Europe today is in low frequency, even in the early farmers, but only starts to spread in the Bronze Age. So this phenotype, which is so typical for Europeans, this light skin, seems to be only about 4,000 years old. So actually quite a recent chapter in our evolution. What we could also
and what you can glean out of that is that he's not saying that we looked like Negroids at all, but that we didn't look like Nordics, that we looked more like this, the tan or slightly swarthy people, more of a Mediterranean look. And that faded as the need for the sunlight waned and so on, but then also through the admixture of all these northern people that had this, and it gets stronger again whenever it gets pegged back in from these people from the east.
Which was quite interesting, is the ability to digest milk during adulthood, so lactase persistence. That's a phenotype that a lot of people attributed to the early agriculturalists. And basically those people that had cows were for sure then also able to drink a lot of milk, but actually the frequency in those people of this gene is actually 0. So they didn't have it. It only appears then during the Bronze Age, and it really spreads only in the last 3,000 years. We're not even sure when.
And that would almost make sense a little bit, that you wouldn't start drinking milk and then try to keep doing it and getting sick off of it, and then have some people that didn't, and everybody wouldn't. But you'd have a few that wouldn't, and that being a better thing would start propagating a little bit more and a little bit more, and then you'd see a jump up, and then this would be propagated to the point that it is today. But it still ain't 100%. There's a lot of people that are lactose intolerant at later age. You're only supposed to have milk from your mother for a good period of time, and then you're weaned on other foods. Milk was used to help sustain and to give extra to people through this whole part whenever they can still drink milk and do things along that line. So,
and it happens during antiquity, during the medieval time, or maybe in the last few hundred years. So I'd like to summarize that the Neolithic revolution is really a diffusion of people. It was people coming to Europe. Those people brought genes, potentially new phenotype, but they also brought new diseases. And that's actually quite exciting, quite interesting, the first evidence we have of that. What we also can say now is it was not just one migration. It was not just those people from the Near East that brought agriculture, but there was a second large migration about 5,000 years ago. Again, we're not really sure why it was triggered, but the introduction of diseases is one possibility.
It's possible they had a disease that made them want to leave that area. It's possible that they left that area for a bunch of different reasons, but whenever we look at it from the other point of view that we've been looking at here recently, I think we see a movement going back, and for a reason, and then not too much longer after that, there's a damn good reason with the Mongols coming down and the Turkish people that followed after that, and then the Ottoman Empire and so on. And it pushed the rest and the remainder of these people over each other, overlapping somewhat, and having a newer mix past this point that again are all primordial Caucasians that you see there. So yeah, just to verify though that he didn't even show the Negroid admix in there. It doesn't even show up on the board really onto doing that. But what it did show is that, and they thought at first, could this guy have Denisovan? Could he be like the people of southern India and so on, and how they get their dark skin? And no, it just seems to be a Mediterranean type variant, that goes on. And I think he showed you well that the pale Caucasians all around North Africa have migrated up in, but they still exist there now, and everybody knows it today with the Berbers and Amazigh and so on, although they have been infiltrated a few times through the Arabic and Islamic slave trade and the Moors, and then the Islamic slave trade that brought more blacks up into the area too, and the dispersion that's come out of that. But yeah, so interesting effect, and I just thought I'd bring this in because it's nice whenever I can bring genetics to what I'm already trying to show people in an archaeological and or physioanthropologic form. Like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy. Much more to come. Peace.